Currently, there's no universal requirement that forensic providers have standard operating procedures, validated techniques, training program for their examiners, proficiency testing program for their examiners, or an overall quality system to ensure correct and consistent results. Forensic science is a high-consequence industry, which essentially means that human life, or the quality of life, is at stake from the work that we do. When someone can spend 33 years in jail for flawed forensic testimony and junk science, or a laboratory can do such poor quality work that it has to be shut down and thousands of cases are affected, we see that human life and the quality of life is affected. Another characteristic of a high-consequence industry is that there's an elevated sense of public accountability, which we see with forensic science because when something goes wrong and it's on the front page of the papers, it's a lead story in the news. So how did we end up there? Well, it has to do with our evolution. Forensic science as it evolved was housed under other parent agencies that had other prime missions. So primarily we find ourselves in law enforcement and sometimes even health departments. And even within those other agencies, there's different levels of government. In the United States, at least, we've got federal, state, county, and municipal. And each of these speaks a different bureaucratic language. So essentially we see that forensic science evolved in the Tower of Babel. One other confounding factor that affected the evolution is the rapid growth occurred without any uniform guidance from the outside. So there was no one telling forensic science what to do. Every agency was left to fend for themselves. And as a result, there's no requirement that providers be accredited. There's no educational requirement for examiners. There's no requirement for examiners to be licensed or certified. If we just look at this first one here, the requirement to be accredited, which would actually encapsulate everything I discussed on that first slide, there have been past efforts to try and get universal accreditation within forensic science. So if we look back to 2009, the National Academy's report, Strengthening Forensic Science, Defining a Path Forward, they actually made a specific recommendation that forensic laboratories should be accredited. It should be mandatory. That's 14 years ago. In 2015, the short-lived National Commission on Forensic Science also made a recommendation, and that recommendation went as far as going to the U.S. Attorney General's office, and the U.S. Attorney at the time, Loretta Lynch, issued a memorandum to the federal government basically saying that you should go and be accredited. However, that memorandum had a little bit of loopholes to it, so we see that it exempted digital evidence analysis, so it's your first loophole, and then later in the memo it actually talks about when practicable, which really presents a huge area of loopholes, meaning that you really don't have to be accredited if you don't want to. So in those particular situations, we see 14 years ago, the National Academy of Sciences issued the report. 7 years ago, the National Commission on Forensic Science made recommendations, and yet we still are not there yet. So why have these past efforts to improve forensic science been ineffective? What I want to propose to you is a model that kind of explains it. So forensic providers are currently at one level. And right now, as there's been increased attention, there's a lot more work that they have, and they don't always have more resources to accompany that additional work. We're now looking at, based on these recommendations, which are reasonable, to now become accredited, which is a lot more work. But additional resources aren't being given to them, and the workload isn't going down. So what we find is that the forensic providers are essentially trying to achieve this goal, but because this goal is at a different level, and they don't have the resources to necessarily get there, it's essentially like trying to fix a plane engine while the plane is flying. And the other thing is, since there aren't additional financial resources, it's really an unfunded mandate. So because of that, these things really haven't worked. So if we take that same model again, what do we need to do to try and make initiatives to increase the quality in forensic science work? Well, the first thing is we need to create the infrastructure to get us from that lower level to the higher level. That's important because if you don't have that, you can't get from one place to the other. It's fairly common sense. But the other thing, which is almost equally important, is we need to come up with an incentive. And the incentive is important because even if the infrastructure is there, we're going to see that people don't always use it to get to the better level. But once we have the combination of the infrastructure and the incentive, then we find it's easier to attain that goal. So today what I'd like to do is talk about creating infrastructure and incentives and how that can increase the quality in forensic science overall. My name's Brian Gestring and I'm a forensic consultant. I've been involved in forensic science for the past 3 decades, both in the public and the private sector. In the public sector, I've worked in nearly every level or in every capacity, from scene investigator to director. I have supervised and managed some of the largest and busiest crime labs in the country. In the private sector, I've taught on the undergraduate and graduate level and directed a university forensic science program and acted as a consultant as I am now. Just going back to what we're talking about with the infrastructure and incentives, we see that combining infrastructure and incentives has worked before. In 1998, the national level of CODIS was implemented. In order to participate, a DNA lab had to be accredited and follow the FBI's quality assurance standards for DNA. That was a big deal. So there was initially some limited assistance that was provided. That was your infrastructure. And I put a little ladder here because it wasn't a lot, but it was something. But you could not search the national database unless you were accredited. And that was a huge incentive, because essentially it's not worth running a DNA lab if you can't access the national database. So we see that this limited initiative had the single largest increase in quality, in forensic science quality, in my lifetime. It combined both some infrastructure and some incentives, and instantly it got the results it needed, where we see these other initiatives through both the National Academy's report and the National Commission on Forensic Science have essentially languished. But what we'll see here is that infrastructure alone is not as effective. So back in 1986, there was a rape murder that occurred in a small England town. The police investigated it. Within the first day, they had developed a suspect. He was a cook at a local mental hospital. After a grueling 15-hour interrogation, he confessed to the crime. So they arrested Richard Buckland for the rape and murder of Dawn Ashworth. In this situation, they were happy that they arrested the suspect. The public was happy. But there was another case that occurred 3 years prior that was almost identical in every respect. And police really believed that Richard Buckland was responsible for this one as well. But the problem is, Richard Buckland, while he confessed to the first, would not in any way confess to the second or say anything about it. So they actually reached out to a local university professor, Alec Jeffries, who was doing this new novel idea of looking at DNA for immigration cases. And be careful what you wish for, because you just might get it. In this case, they inadvertently stumbled across the first DNA exoneration, because Richard Buckland was in no way associated with either case. And then subsequently, this took them to the actual person who was the perpetrator of these crimes a little bit later. In 2009, we saw that National Academy report that we previously mentioned talked about preserving evidence, and as a result, that same year, the National Institute of Standards and Technology and the National Institute of Justice established a technical working group on biological evidence preservation, looking at how you can preserve this evidence. And this group was composed of people from the innocence movement, from property managers, from law enforcement, and from forensic laboratory people. And they created guidance that people could use that was off the shelf, and you can still find these as PDF documents. The first was a biological evidence preservation handbook that could be used for agencies to develop their own biological evidence preservation guidelines. And then they went further and actually did one, considerations for policymakers. So if a state was looking to adopt a biological evidence retention policy, this group had already done a lot of the heavy lifting, so they could just take these documents off the shelf and really have a good step forward to try and finalize something that was really essential for the last 37 years. Fast forward now to this past December, to a warehouse fire in Brooklyn, New York. This warehouse fire is remarkable for one reason. This warehouse housed almost all of the DNA evidence for the city of New York. And as you can imagine, even the local press said that the evidence lost in this warehouse fire could mean the end of the fight for the wrongly convicted. And they're absolutely right. So let's just look at this now from a bigger lens. 37 years ago, we see the power of this evidence to exonerate. 36 years ago, we see the power of this evidence to try and identify the true perpetrator. 14 years ago, we see both the National Academy's report and the assembling of this technical working group on biological evidence retention. Then this group issued guidance both 10 years ago and 8 years ago. And now, 2 months ago, we see this fire that nearly wiped out all of New York City's DNA evidence. So what does this last incident have to do with the previous ones? Well, to me, it's one of interest. because beyond the policies, the internal policies of the NYPD, there was no requirement for the NYPD to even retain any of this biological evidence because New York State does not have a biological evidence retention policy. So in the year 2023, New York State doesn't have any guidelines for any agency to hold on to biological evidence. So what happened here? Let's take a look at this model we showed you before. So New York State's on one level. It's trying to get to the next level. There's the infrastructure. We see this set up. But the problem is, while the infrastructure is in place, and it's in place since 2015, so about 8 years ago, there's no incentive. And since there's no incentive, New York State hasn't moved. Now, how can we fix this problem? Well, since we already have the infrastructure in place, we just need to look at an appropriate incentive. And in this particular case, one thing we can look at, here's just a clip from last November, talking about $160 million in federal funding that was issued out to local agencies. And obviously all of that didn't go to New York State. But if we say, listen, New York State, you're not eligible for any federal funding until you get a biological evidence retention policy, I feel pretty confident New York State will have a biological evidence retention policy pretty quickly. And partly because all the information is already there. You just have to take it off the shelf, sit down, and do a little bit of work to get there. So can we use this model to adopt across forensic science disciplines and try and get increasing quality? I think you can, and I think I'm going to try and tackle the biggest and what I believe is the hardest one, which is establishing a goal of universal accreditation for crime scene units, forensic laboratories, latent print units, and digital forensic units. Let's say we want to do this by 2029. First, we're going to identify the obstacles that are in our path. What are the system limitations? Are there enough accreditation providers to meet the need? Because if we don't have the capacity of the people that are actually going to do the laboratory inspections, then that's a problem we have to address. How many forensic service providers are there? We saw that there were some statistics put out about through the Census of Publicly Funded Crime Laboratories. The data is woefully out of date, and even when it was current, I think it was not accurate. So this really needs to be done properly. We need to find a way to figure out how many providers there are so we can gauge if we have enough accreditation providers before we see how many forensic service providers there are. There's limitations that the forensic science providers have as well. What resources do they have available to try and do this undertaking? And overall, you're dealing with a lot of staff that's unfamiliar with the accreditation process and how to achieve or maintain it. So there needs to be some training. And I think to try and achieve penetration to this group, web-based training would be a great way to start doing it and starting to do that early so people can see the need and the importance of doing this. Then a phased implementation plan. And by a phased implementation plan, what I mean is you take that big process of becoming accredited and break it down into easily digestible chunks. Within 12 months, you purchase a copy of this standard. You identify top and key management. Within 18 months, you have SOPs in place, including training programs, quality programs, and an internal audit document. Within 24 months, you have an annual proficiency testing program that also allows for corrective action if problems are identified with the proficiency testing program. Within 30 months, you're doing an internal audit, which means you look at your own agency based on the standards you developed. Within 36 months, you're looking at having someone from the outside look at your agency based on the standards you developed. 48 months, you're actually applying for accreditation, and by 60 months, you're actually getting it. So that's a 5-year goal and giving a little bit of wiggle room in the beginning to try and assess how many providers and to assess if there's enough accreditation vendors to try and do the job. Now the incentive, and I think the incentive I mentioned before, I think is a decent one, and I think let's just use that. So now let's take our model again. We've got our goal, we've got our incentive, so we have to make sure the obstacles and the phased implementation plan are appropriate. And the reason this is so important for such a big goal like this, maybe if you have a smaller goal, it's not a big deal, but for this one, if it turns out that the cost of doing this outweighs the benefits, then you really risk that the providers will throw in the towel or fold. And if that happens, you have an entire system collapse and you lose capacity, which we can't afford to do. So it needs to be done in a smart way, so that way everyone is moving at a gentle pace and moving in a step forward. So we talked before about the different steps, identifying the number of forensic service providers, determining the capacity of the current accreditation providers, getting the standards and identifying top and key management, making training available, having template SOPs might be a good thing to do. You could have a consultant create these so they could be off-the-shelf templates laboratories could use and adopt to their own system, or providers could. They would then have to have SOPs in place, including training programs, quality programs, and internal audits, undergo an internal audit, undergo an external audit, apply for accreditation, obtain accreditation, and then that big part, which is maintain accreditation. So when we look at the situation, what we find is that forensic science is not the only high consequence industry, but in my knowledge, it's the only one that relies exclusively on voluntary compliance to try and get the quality that we need. And that's something we really need to change. Thanks for your time. My name is Brian Gestring. If you have any questions or would like to reach out to me, my contact information is here. I'd love to hear from you.